Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be looking at the Fear and Greed Index. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Just as a reminder, you can find the website for the Fear and Greed Index here. I'll provide a link to it in the description below. It is an index that a lot of people use to sort of gauge whether the overall market sentiment is fearful or greedy. And the reason why we talk about this is because also the general idea is that you sell into greed and you buy into fear. Now, what's interesting is if you sold all your Bitcoin anytime the fear and greed index hit 90, then that would not necessarily be the best strategy. You can see an example here in 2020 where Bitcoin's fear and greed index was at 90 when the price was at 15.62K. And this was just before the price rallied to $64,000 just a few months later. But there is a way we can kind of clean this up. You could apply a moving average to it. Now, moving averages, of course, by definition, are going to be lagging indicators. But if you applied, say, a 30-day EMA to the fear and greed index, it would have at least allowed you to not see the 90 level on the fear and greed until the price of Bitcoin were just a bit higher, let's say $22,000 to $23,000. So it would have occurred $8,000 higher than than we previously set. If you looked at something like, say, a 14-day EMA, you can see that it would have occurred, of course, it would have occurred slightly sooner. So the whole idea is to essentially come up with a simple moving average that works best for you. Now, a 30-day moving average, you can see that the fear and greed index would have reached that 90 level closer to around $18,000 to $19,000. So in a bull market characterized like the last one that we saw, selling all your Bitcoin just because the fear and greed index hit 90 would not have necessarily been the best strategy. So we must understand that. But as it spent a lot of time up here and then started to put in lower highs, that might have been a more interesting signal to pay attention to, right? So like, for instance, if you look in 2019, the fear and greed index was putting in higher lows and higher highs. But then at some point in 2019, you can see that it peaked and then it sort of put in a double top. It was a slightly lower high, but the fear and greed index dropped a lot. So this first high, the fear and greed index was at 95. Now this is an example where selling it all above 90 would have actually worked out quite well. This was also in the pre-halving year. But the second peak that occurred just a few weeks later at more or less the same price was a fear and greed index of 84. The next peak that occurred at just a couple $1,000s below this one, the fear and greed index was at 66. So we were seeing some type of, the fear and greed index was basically putting in lower highs while Bitcoin was also putting in lower highs. And in one of these cases, it wasn't really that much of a lower high. It was sort of almost like a double top. That's an interesting way to look at the market. You can look at it over here and see that the fear and greed index was just sort of hanging around this 80 to 90 level for a long time, and then came back up to this level. But once we hit that $58,000 level, the fear and greed index from that point on was just putting in lower highs. And so that might actually be a better way to use this metric to see that, okay, if the price of Bitcoin is slowly pushing higher, but the fear and greed is actually going lower, it means that social interest is actually starting to wane, and we're not seeing that same type of FOMO necessarily that we saw on these first rallies. And so if people are not coming in as much into the market, if that FOMO doesn't exist as much anymore, then it could be a sign that the rally is fizzling out. So you can see that occurred, of course, in 2019 and in 2021. What we see today, we've seen higher lows and higher highs. However, the highest the fear and greed index got, at least so far in 2023, was around 69. You can see that we did push higher, of course, later on, but the fear and greed index was at only 64. So if I've seen a lot of people that are very bullish on Bitcoin for the second half of the year, and I don't necessarily share in that optimism. I mean, I have said that the highest I could see Bitcoin going this year is $35,000. It is still possible, but the further we get into the year, I think it's becoming less and less likely, especially because we're in that August to September timeframe, which tends to correspond to a risk-off environment in equities, which typically pushes Bitcoin below the bull market support band. That's what we've seen every prior cycle. Bitcoin fall below its 20-week SMA in August or September of the pre-halving year. We are at least seeing some confluence in the fact that the Fear and Greed Index is also putting in potentially some lower highs as well. And historically, that sort of marked a transitional period. Now, you can see that in 2021, it put in lower highs, but the price of Bitcoin was putting in slightly higher highs, right? Like it was only slightly higher. It's kind of like how in April we put in a high, and we came back down, and yes, we technically did go higher on some of these moves here, but it was only very marginally higher, and the fear and greed index has put in a lower high. So I guess the question is do all future moves just end up being a lower high on the fear and greed index, which is a possibility considering that the social risk that we previously talked about has also been in a downtrend. So if you are bullish going into the end of the year, then I imagine one of the things you would want to see would be to see the fear and greed index start printing in the 70s. If the fear and greed index can go into the 70s, then that would be a sign that that this would be finding a higher high for the fear and greed index. However, if you just constantly see it putting in levels below 70, that would be indicative of just interest in the space slowly waning. So just something to think about. You can also look at this by color coding it. And I think one interesting thing to do is to only highlight like the low levels, like the 0 to 10 and maybe the 10 to 20, and then also the 80 to 90 and 90 to 100, right? So if you only ever bought when the fear and greed index was between 0 to 20 and only ever sold when it was between 80 to 100, you would generally be doing pretty well. With that said, there would be times like late 2021 where if you were buying into that, it was not really a great time to do so, because we saw, what came not too long after it. Just like over here in 2018, if you were buying all these dips, at some point you would have watched the price go down another 50%, and you would have been like, well, why didn't I just wait? And of course, you can apply moving averages to it, and that might help clean it up a little bit, right? So if you look at it like with a moving average, it cleans it up a little bit, as you can see. So you wouldn't have bought all these dips. You might have bought a little bit here and then a little bit more here and then some here. And you would have been doing pretty well as it came up into these regions. Buying some here would have worked out, even though it wouldn't have gone back up into those levels when you take a 30-day SMA. And of course, buying here wouldn't have necessarily worked out immediately, but we are actually at the same prices, more or less, as where we were back over here. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Just another way to look at the fear and greed index. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. See you guys next time. Bye.